So we've looked at the structure. Now it's time to build the queries that are going to power our grids. Okay, so first of all, we start with the easy dialog with the books. The books are going to be just a grid listing all the books. And then we also have one additional field with the memo of the description. Description, if we go back to the database model and look at the structure right here, the description is defined as long text. I didn't define that as blob. Why did I make that a long text? And again, if we look at documentation, there is a difference between DT memo and DT blob, indeed, in the VCL, how the VCL handles the data. This is binary data, and this is considered multi-line textual data, so to speak. Again, in SQLite, it doesn't make a difference, but for how the VCL interprets it, it makes a difference. So that's the reason why I made it long text and the other one blob, just so you know. That makes a difference. And that gives me the ability to bind this to a DB-driven memo control. Okay, that's the reason why I did it this way. Otherwise, blob, I don't know if that will work with every memo control that you have. That's the reason why I did that. Okay, so how do we get the data in FireDAC? First of all, I said we already introduced the connection, and then we need a query, a TFD query. And again, active start usage, set these all to false, because if you tinker with them at design time and leave active true, and you also leave AU design time true, that active state will carry towards the application runtime execution. Sorry, if you also leave AU runtime true, that would also, which is the default setting, it will also be true at runtime. And that would mean that your query will get executed as soon as this form is created before, and this is the nasty thing, before you're able to set the database name to the database name that's in your code. So that would then try to open the database that is specified at design time inside of this field, and most likely will fail. Would work fine on my computer, but will most likely fail on yours. That's the reason. So looking at this, the query books, we can simply double click. That's the nice thing about it. Name it, of course, that's the first thing. You just name it query books. We double click. Don't go here and click this. That will just give you the Knopke way of showing a T-string list. We need double click, and that gives you a wonderful SQL editor, which you can even use with execute. And because I have set everything up to my database, I literally get the results at design time. The only thing, I think I'll file a bug report about this because of the width, the standard width is used. Maybe we could get it like double click here. No, don't have that, so you do this. And then you get all the different columns. By the way, we see that the strings work fine. And here, the white memo, that's exactly what I said. If you try to bind a memo control to a cell or an edit control, you'll end up with these placeholders. You could, of course, implement the get method of the field, but I'm digressing again. So that would give you data in there, but you should always be able to use the default stuff easily, which our current configuration guarantees. So that's it. Basically, we select star from books and order by the publication date in descending order. That means the book that I published last is on top. That's it. That's the whole query. And with that, we can define a data source to the dataset, 3 books. And then if we go to the form books, it has a DB grid, and the data source, and this is true that I do this, the data source, I set it at design time. You might wonder, we removed all these things. Does this still work? Yes, it does still work. So if we go to the data source setting, if I can find it right here, I set it to, and this it works. You set it to dbmanager.sourcebooks. That works because our data module is named DB Manager. And with recent try and errors, I was quite surprised. The VCL is so smart, it would even be able to deduce this at runtime as long as your data module gets created before the form. But we're not going there. We're writing proper code to hook it up using object references. But even using this kind of reference at design time would suffice in most cases. I was quite surprised that that is the case, but it does. So we hook it up to dbmanager.sourcebooks. If you have a problem with that we use a data source which is hosted on a data module, please go ahead, drop another data source on this form, and then basically hook up that data source to the dbmanager.query, and you have your data sources on the form. So that's not going to be an issue. And with that, you can add with a double click. Well, we're not there yet, because right now you wouldn't have any columns, right? You would have the default column. So we go here, right click, and click Fields Editor. Or Fields Editor, because you can't double click. If you double click on a data set in the VCL, you get the Field Editor. Now here we have to right click Fields Editor. And then here we have the ID, title, subtitle, cover, publish, all the descriptions. Why do I get this? Right click, add fields. And this available fields would usually show the available fields if you haven't added them before. And then something I do all the time, ID I completely ignore, but here for title, I add a display label and a display width. And to my total surprise, the DB grid, the default control, does not put any consideration to this value. It always uses size to calculate the default column width in the grid, so you will have to adjust that as well, and does not put the display width into consideration. But other controls from TMS, for example, do. So it is always a good idea to find a display width. And for the published, which is a date, I picked an edit mask. So I go here and then pick the edit mask. And that will transfer into the DB grid. So if I look here and go into books, and if I were to add another book, and I go over here, I literally get the mask for the date time included in Delphi, no third party, okay? And a lot of people don't realize this is where you can do it. You can define an edit mask on the field level. You get a date field because it's a date. There's also another thing. You get a white memo field. You get a blob field. You get a white string field for the strings. And those work fine with t-edit and cells and all those components. Okay, so with that in place, you can go over to the books, double click here, and then you can add all fields and configure your columns in the grid, all at design time. You can also set the field of your memo. Once again, you set the data source and set the data field, and that top part is done. Now the tricky part. We are navigating in the additions table, so we need an addition, query additions, and that query is going to be select star from additions, where books ID equals ID parameter. This ID, where does that come from? Well, it comes from the master table. So we have here the query additions. We scroll down. It has a master source, which is source books. That's why I said we need the source. Source books is linked to query books. And then we define master fields. So we can go here. I selected ID, and that is what is used in the parameter. Okay, so this ID actually gets, if I double click here, gets replaced here. So this ID is the ID of the record that is current in source books right now, and uses that to select the additions table. And I also specified here, just in case, the detail field. I don't know if I even need that with specifying the select, because there's, again, Carrie Jensen's book, there's multiple ways to hook up your tables. I think there's also a setup nowadays. See how to set up detail links of query into master query. You can modify a SQL and all this, it generates this all for you. So FireDAC has really done a lot recently in that department. Again, we need a data source pointing to the editions, and then it's really as easy as this. We go back to the books table, have a second grid. That grid points to DB Manager source editions. Same procedure. We go to query editions, right click, field editor, add all fields. We get the fields, the string fields, integer field, and so on, and can then link that to the grid to show the editions. No magic needed for the detail relationship. It is all automatic. And of course, the control here would be a TDB image control. You would link that to the cover of the book as well. With regards to imaging, we have to do a little bit more work because they pick the different approach, more flexible approach, so to speak, in code. So if we, let me show that right away here, to set up the form, and we set up the form that has nothing to do with imaging, by the way. Just how do we set everything up, right? Like we need, at runtime, we need to tell the form where the data sources are, right? So, and where the data sets are. And in order to do that, we get the TDB manager shared. So this is this L manager here, through code completion, is actually our data module with all the queries and all the sources, right? But this is at runtime. So you might wonder, where do you create this data module? Well, if it's the first time I call TDB manager shared, it's getting created. If it's the second time, it's the reference that has been created before. That's how neat it is. And with that, I can set the data source of the DB navigator right here to the source books. And the same for the books grid. For this here, the data source, I set it to source books as well. And with regards to the image field, I have to use a command from imaging. I say TIE DB bitmap, because imaging doesn't distinguish between bitmaps and pictures. Everything's a bitmap, kind of like FireMonkey. FireMonkey has the same approach, and then you specify as the first parameter, you specify the data source, which is L manager source books. The second is the string, which identifies the blob field, which is cover, which contains the image blob. And we don't need this. This is like a file name field if you have the image in files. We don't have that. We have the image inside of our blob field. So imaging would also allow you to have a database, and the database has a file name associated with it, and then you access that image using the file name in this. And then you can bind this to the control, which is not a TDB image, it's a T-imaging view, which is not usually database bound. They basically have the same control for different bindings, kind of like the same thing as FireMonkey does, because FireMonkey also doesn't have DB controls. Instead, it has bindings, and this binds the imaging view control to the cover image, which we defined as a bitmap inside of a database record. That's how you have to read this. And then finally, the editions grid gets the source editions as data source. And that's it. That's how it works. And with the magic of Delphi, you get everything, because we have the database controller, so I can add, delete, I can navigate, and I can simply add text to the markdown. This is how I set everything up. The only thing still missing, you might wonder, let's create another book. Let's say here. So the title is Holger's Next Book, and the subtitle is Another Adventure in Delphi. And I'm going to release that, of course, on my birthday, 5/11/2024. Like this. And here's some markup, markdown. And then I have two editions, color ASIN is 4711, and then we have the hardcover 4712, like that. So those are the two editions. And also, the book binds to the cover, not the edition. So even though editions might have different colors, for example, the cover and black and white edition have different colors, I still hooked the cover to the book. You could do something different, but in this case, I didn't want to have two covers for the same book. You know, it doesn't really matter. So here we have Holger's Next Book, no cover. So if I double click, I can open covers. And I use a dialog from the imaging library. You see all the image formats they support natively. And that was the number one reason why I wanted, why I integrated this. You can do the very same thing using the standard Delphi dialog, open picture dialog, right here. So if I go here, open, you have the open picture dialog, and then you have to integrate PNG image and JPEG image into the users clause, and that gives you access to PNG, JPEG. And with TWIC image, you have even more image formats, but all this would have required me 1 to 3 more hours of implementation work. And if I just use Imaging, I have all the image formats that I need. And how do I implement the loading? Because there is no difference if it is if I use Imaging or whatever. So I load the image, I execute the dialog, same code as if I were to use the VCL control, and I get the data set associated with the data source. So you can jump into the data set. So you don't need to basically write this. L manager, I think. Sorry, F. So TDB manager dot shared dot. You could do this, right? But then you would have to know which query is actually being shown in the grid, right? So it's much better to write, go to your books, that's the grid, and then you go data source, and then you go data set, and then you have the query as well, just for the T data set, and that's all you need. You don't need to know that it's a query. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility. So the data set has to be, in order to load an image or edit an image, it has to be in edit state. So we say LTS edit. If it is not, DS edit mode gives you the information if the data set is in edit mode. And then we say LDS field by name cover, that is the blob field, typecast to blob field, and then we have the method available load from file, and then we load the image from the file, the binary data. We're not interpreting it as a bitmap or PNG or whatever. We load the binary data using load from file into the database field, and that's the key here. We use the binary data. We didn't define it as a graphic field or anything. We defined it as a blob field. That's binary data. That's it. And if you link this in your user interface to a TDB image, you better hope that it's a graphic format that Delphi supports, meaning PNG, JPEG, or a third-party library like Graphics32 adds more image formats into this. Or you use a third-party library like Imaging, which supports all of them if you bind it to it. So it doesn't really matter which picture format you use. So that's the magic behind it. Your database programming doesn't change no matter what the image format is. You just load the binary information. And then don't forget to post, and that stores it in the database. And that is no matter, by the way, that's something I haven't mentioned so far at all. Obviously, the SQL statements that we use are pretty basic and can be transferred to other databases as well. Still, right now, everything is set up for SQLite, but changing the connection to another database, you could, of course, transfer this project to any other database. However, the advantage of using an object relational mapper would be that you don't have to write SQL. Instead, you only use classes, and you wouldn't have to change the SQL statements when you switch to a different database, because that's exactly what an object relational mapper does for you. Just wanted to point this out. So right now, everything is pretty tied to SQLite with our statements. And with that, the books dialog is done. So we have a list of books with a list of editions, and everything can be edited. We can delete books, we can edit books. It all works out. The next step are the stores.